Good evening, everyone. I'm Ginger Gadsden. Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Real Talk. Tonight, we are discussing equality in schools. Students in Central Florida have returned to the classroom, and one thing that is constant for all students this year is different. COVID-19 has presented unprecedented hurdles from safety to the overall learning experience. But Black and minority students are faced with even more challenges. Schools across Central Florida are back open, while some struggle to keep up with new health risks in the classroom.
We don't want to make the pandemic worse. If you do this wrong, the school becomes the germ factory.
I'm scared to death that someone's going to get sick, and very seriously sick.
Others struggle to figure out learning from home.
I think they're having a problem getting the video started.
We expect it to be better tomorrow and even better the next day, so it'll get better with time.
Other issues have not disappeared. Statistics show some Black students are dealing with a different educational experience than their white counterparts. The Florida Department of Education shows in Orange County, Black students graduated at a lower rate than every other group last year. And the most recent civil rights data shows Black kids in that county spent nearly 6 times as many days suspended and out of the classroom than white students, and were more than 2 times as likely to be referred to law enforcement. In one extreme circumstance, things ended like this. A 6-year-old was handcuffed and arrested at her Orlando school last year following a temper tantrum.
When children are arrested, their lives are forever changed, and we have to admit that it may not be worth the psychological scarring for very young children that could have been managed with common sense.
Stanford University says disproportionate punishment and poor academic results go hand in hand. Add to that, many say they had to wait years to see a teacher who looked like them in the classroom and are still waiting for a curriculum that reflects them.
We're not putting enough emphasis on making sure that there is a cultural variety in the curricula that we're presenting.
So while juggling a laundry list of new challenges, many Black students are still struggling with equality issues this school year. So for the next hour or so, we will be discussing those issues. Joining us tonight to discuss these issues is our panel of distinguished guests. Osceola County Superintendent Dr. Deborah Pace, Assistant Professor of Urban Education at UCF, Dr. L. Trenton S. Marsh, President and CEO of the Central Florida Urban League, Glenn Gilzian Jr., Cocoa High School teacher Stephanie Lay, and Evans High School senior and President of Central Florida's Future Leaders, Wedna Del Therese. Thank you all so much and welcome, and thanks for being here with us tonight. We want to get right to it. So we want to begin with this question. What is the biggest challenge to providing an equal educational experience for every student? And Dr. Pace, we're going to start with you diving right into this question.
Well, thank you, Ginger. You know, right now, because we are faced with the option of both face-to-face and digital learning, I would say that one of the most significant challenges that we all have is access to technology, both in terms of the digital devices and the Wi-Fi that we need consistently across the district. Osceola County serves both urban environment as well as rural environment, and even having a hotspot sometimes isn't adequate. So we're all striving very, very hard to make sure that we have adequate resources to serve all of our students, but that is a significant hurdle for all of us right now across Florida.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot about Wi-Fi issues and how some parents have to go to parking lots of fast food restaurants to even just have access for their kids to get online. Dr. Marsh, what about you?
I think that one thing that we need to address, and I know I have colleagues on the panel that will certainly agree, that we need to sort of reframe, I think, what the conversation should be about. So oftentimes people are thinking about academic achievements and their gaps. But I think we need to address a larger question is, are we addressing the right question? So maybe not equality, but maybe the conversation needs to be more around equity. And on top of that, when you're thinking about equity context, you need to have experiences for our young people that are affirming all young people's experiences that are affirming.
Okay. And Ms. Lay?
Having the resources available for students to be able to continue the quality education.
Mr. Gilzian, what's your answer to that question?
So I would say, I would look at it from the village model, which is where it takes a village to raise a child. And in this COVID world where mom is trying to figure out how to keep a roof over her head for the family, how she's going to keep food on the table, I think holistically is how to provide an education. I know moms are superwomen and superheroes, but now you're asking them to step up and be an academic teacher as well, on top of being the first teacher. So I think it's just holistically, COVID has just really put a major hurdle in the conversation as it relates to equity and also equality in education.
Yeah, that's a tough question. And Wedda, we want to see if you are able to answer that question as well for us, because you're a student, your experience is obviously different than everyone else on the panel. What do you think the answer to that question is? What is the biggest challenge to providing an equal education for every student such as yourself?
The biggest obstacle in providing an equal education is the division of attention. You know, you have some students that are in school, and then you have the other students that are online, and sometimes even when I'm in class, I'm asking questions to my teacher and I'm typing, and she doesn't answer it till 10 minutes later. And it takes, it's really hard to finish your assignments and turn them in on time and to efficiently work during class, because you're stuck on this problem and you can't move on, and she doesn't answer to you, and it's not like you can go up to her desk or anything, you know?
Sure, and I imagine that that's pretty difficult, and by the time you do get an answer, do you feel like you become more disengaged, or are you still just trying to remain engaged?
It's a battle between being engaged and disengaged as well. So sometimes I may feel really engaged and I'm trying very hard, but then I start to disconnect and I just say, you know, I can do it this my way, you know, because it's almost that you're teaching yourself when you're at home. You know, you don't get that one-on-one, even when you're in the classroom, you don't get that one-on-one connection, but it's still face-to-face, and you can see and see the teachers do examples, and it's easy to raise your hand and say, I need help with this, and her to remember that you needed help, than versus you being online and she forgot completely that you had a question, because there's so many children typing in the chat.
Yeah, that's a lot to manage on both ends of that. Okay, so we've asked people all week and leading up into this discussion to send in their questions to figure out what's the most pressing issue on their minds. And one of the first questions we have is for Dr. Pace. And Heather wants to know, she says, knowing the statistics around racial disparities in school punishment, what programs or policies will the school board be implementing to decrease these disparities? And before you answer that question, Dr. Pace, we have a graphic to illustrate a stat that we found. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Black children represent 35% of juveniles arrested, despite making up 15% of the youth population. You can see the disparity there. So what Heather is asking, what sort of programs will be implemented to decrease those disparities?
I'm a big believer, Ginger, in positive behavior intervention support and restorative practices. So really looking at reframing the topic of discipline around teaching as opposed to punishment. You know, when a child doesn't know how to read, we teach them to read. When a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach them to swim. But if a child is having problems interacting with others without anger, or if a child is having problems paying attention in a focused environment for a rather long period of time, should we punish? Or should we help teach them better ways to go about those types of interactions? You know, back in 2003, I became a principal for the first time at Poinciana High School, a high minority urban environment. And we decided that positive behavior support was going to be a way for us to reframe our conversations about discipline. And when it comes to restorative practices, we're looking at not just what a child did wrong, but what can we do to make it right with those affirmative statements that Dr. Marsh talked about. So really engaging the adults and the students in conversations about how we can look at discipline differently, how we can agree on common expectations, how we can teach and model those expectations and reinforce them, as opposed to punishing, I have found very, very effective. You know, in looking at our discipline data, our Black students, our Hispanic students, our male students in particular, were suspended more last year than other students. but it's still better than it was, and we're continuing to work toward improving that. As Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better, and that is our intention for the coming year.
Yeah, and so many districts have to do better. And you know, in the opening package, we had the example of the 6-year-old who was simply throwing a temper tantrum and was arrested. How do we get to that point? How did an adult make that decision to call in someone to arrest a 6-year-old where the cuffs were even too big for her little wrists? So how do we stop something like this from happening? Because if this is this child's first interaction with law enforcement, well, that can be very damning and very scarring moving forward.
It absolutely can, but I have to tell you, I am very, very proud of the strong relationships that our school district has, both with our sheriff's office and our local city police departments, the city of St. Cloud and the city of Kissimmee. We provide extreme training for our school resource officers in youth mental health first aid so that they can identify, just as our counselors do, our social workers do, when those behaviors are really not about a discipline issue, but more about something that's missing inside that we need to try to get to help correct the behavior and control the situation. And we've had a lot of success in that, and they're very committed to making sure that we have the right people in our schools so that kids' first interaction with a law enforcement officer is a positive role model, not just about safety and security, although certainly that's also important.
Sure. Ms. Lay, can you weigh in on that? You're a teacher in the classroom, and I would imagine you have seen a number of students who have probably been restless, or sometimes they're mouthy, or just being a kid in school. How would you have handled that situation, or what would you suggest in handling a situation where a child is throwing a temper tantrum?
I think it's important when you're in the classroom as an educator that you have high standards and high expectations of your students, both academically and behaviorally. And I work very hard with my students to create a relaxed environment and work on what my expectations are and redirection. And instead of the negative behavior and focusing on the negative behavior, I focus on how to redirect what is a proper way. How else can we handle this? So the students have to then take responsibility for their actions.
Okay, we have a question that came in for Dr. Marsh. And while most of our responses to Real Talk, when we ask people to send in their comments and questions, they've been pretty positive. We did receive some negative remarks from people who may not understand why these topics, or a topic like this one, is so important. So Millie writes that there was no mention of inequality before the Obama administration, and now this kind of propaganda, and that's her word, not ours, seems to be all the rage. So, Dr. Marsh, how would you answer Millie in this question? Because I feel like the premise is not right. I think there was a you people thrown in there as well, which we didn't include. But how would you answer Millie's question?
Sure. I would tell Millie about a study around 1970. A sociologist by the name of Rosalie Cohen did a study. And essentially that study, nearly 50 years ago, it was a research study where she went into classrooms across this country, and essentially based off of her research, there was an idea of the essentially how success was defined in the context of this country. So it was operationalized what she identified as a cognitive approach to learning. What we've realized is that the cognitive approach to learning does really well for our students who are white or coming from European models. However, it's suboptimal for our minoritized populations, so Black, Latinx, indigenous populations. Now, what does this mean? This means that we know there are some socially, culturally preferred ways of learning in classroom contexts, but the cognitive approach to learning continues to manifest itself. So this wasn't a conversation that was taking place during Obama's administration. This was a conversation that had been happening since really the foundation of this nation. But again, if we're thinking about the context of the schools, we realize that Black and brown and other minoritized populations learn differently. There needs to be a cultural element to that, right? They prefer communal learning. They prefer relational learning. Again, not that they can't do well in other types of learning environments, but we know that socially, culturally preferred, not biologically determined, they succeed when they are affirmed, when they have a voice, when they feel as if they can connect to their teacher, to their administrator, when they can collaborate. These are things that are connected to this type of learning style that we know is important for minoritized students in this country.
Sure, and you have to teach to the particular students. Is that what you're saying?
Undoubtedly, and this goes to what Dr. Pace was articulating, this idea of affirmation statements. But at the end of the day, we want to have classrooms that are affirming of everyone's experience. So whether that means you speak another language at home, we're not going to articulate that you have to assimilate to only speak English in the context of the classroom, but we're going to value that, right? We're going to value everything that you bring into this context of this classroom setting. And I think that's what it's oftentimes missing. This idea that when you come into this classroom, there's certain ways and ways that we're going to learn and speak and behave, but that is not fully affirming people's experiences.
Now, Mr. Gilson, we have a question that came in online for you as well, and it says, how do you feel schools in local urban areas differ from those in more affluent neighborhoods? And before you answer that, and I feel like something needs to be unpacked about why people live in particular areas, and it all goes to neighborhoods and loans and mortgages, and how minorities are denied mortgages and can only live in certain neighborhoods, and that determines what schools those kids go to. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. So we know that historically there was a thing called redlining. And redlining basically was a policy created to limit African Americans from moving into the suburbs, specifically white communities. And when we think about how certain zip codes, even in Orange County and here in the Central Florida area, you see how like the communities that have a low to moderate income community, that the schools are not the highest rated. Prime example, you look at certain areas like Paramore, Pine Hills compared to Windermere and Winter Park, Lake Nona, and you compare the elementary schools in those areas, and you'll see a vast difference between the grades that those schools have going forward. But here's the thing. I truly believe that in today's world and moving forward, we have to find solutions to improving the educational opportunities for those children. And what am I saying? This is an opportunity for us to figure out how we customize education for the individual child. Similar to what the professor was saying earlier, it's about, and I'm going to put it in simple terms, he used a lot of really cool big terms, but the messenger is equally important as the message. So as we can identify community leaders, if we can identify more educators that understand the needs and the plight of the community, then we'll be able to further the educational enrichment moving forward. And I think that's part of the solution going forward is making sure that there's equity in education. And going back to what the professor said earlier of how it's not about equality. It really is. Let's find ways of, if we know that there's a particular school that's underrated in math, let's figure out how we get more resources. Let's figure out how we get more mentors. Let's figure out how we get more tools to that specific community, so then that way they can now get a hand up versus a handout.
But it also depends on what that school has to offer as well. In some schools, in certain neighborhoods, you have more money, so they are able to offer more resources. So what's the answer there?
So it's real simple, and I'm going to use Orange County for example. Most people think Orange County School Board's budget is in the hundreds of millions, but in actuality, Orange County School Board budget is well over $3 billion with a B. So now it becomes a situation of our political leaders, our school board members, making sure that the right policies are in place and making sure that the distribution of resources are going where it needs to go. That's where the battle of the trenches per se needs to happen. So communities like the Pine Hills need to go to their respective school board member and say, we demand, if you're asking for our vote, we demand that you advocate for more resources, more equity in education as it relates to our schools, because we know the district has it. It's not a resource issue. It's not a money issue. It's an allocation issue.
So, Wedna, you're a senior at Evans High School, and I would imagine that your experience has been different than other students there. Can you give us an example of what you've experienced, this being your senior year compared to other years before? What has your experience been? Because you're in a pretty rigorous program as well.
My experience during my senior year has been completely different, of course, from my junior year, my sophomore, and my freshman year. Ginger, do you mind repeating the question?
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. But as a black student and you're in this program, how has your experience been different than, say, maybe your white counterparts?
I can give a great example for that. I was at a college career resource field trip, and we were looking at different colleges we wanted to attend to, and there it was this male, and he was different skin tone than me. He came up to me and he started a conversation, and he asked me, "What school do you go to?" And I said, "Oh, I go to Maynard Evans High School. I'm a part of the IB program." And he looked at me in a shocking way. He was like, "IB?" I was like, "Yes, we have IB." And he was like, "Oh, wow." He was like, "You're very smart and you speak proper for a black girl." And immediately, the smile on my face had been wiped away. I began to think to myself, do I have to be less? Did he expect less of me because of my skin tone? Does he expect less of my brothers and my sisters around me, my classmates that look like me?
Yeah, that's, I could see why that smile was wiped away from your face. But what does that tell you, Wedna, when you are faced with a question like that they don't expect you to be articulate? And like some people think it's a compliment to say, "Oh, you're so well spoken."
I didn't hear you, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's just a difficult situation to have to deal with, and I know you're a young lady and you handled it with absolute grace. So I want to ask Ms. Lay, as a teacher in the classroom, how would you suggest that a student like Wedna and others maybe handle a question like that when someone just assumes that they should not be as bright or as articulate as they are? What would be your response, or to how to help that child cope with a question like that? Because that's difficult.
I encourage my students because they're in an educational setting, so I encourage them to present themselves as an educated student. There is no set way for you to talk based on your skin tone. If you want to sound as if you are educated, then that's what you do. If you are in an IB program, you're in an advanced program, or any other program for that matter. Make sure that you present yourself in the highest light to whomever. And if those people doubt you, I encourage my students to make sure that they are representing themselves to the best of their ability.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to a question that I have, because it took me to up until middle school in order to see a teacher who looked like me, Mrs. Grady, and that changed my entire world. It changed my life. How important is it for a student to have a teacher in the classroom who can speak to their experience, who has had some of their same experiences? Dr. Pace, I'll start with you.
I really think that's critically important. I know that, I have a close relationship with our local NAACP chapter. In fact, the president was my 9th grade English teacher and a highly successful principal in our school district. And she and I talk often about how we want more black educators in our classrooms, because kids do need to see them. We have made a commitment in our district to diversify our administration. We only have about 30% of our administrators who are minority, but we have at least one in all 58% of our schools. So we're getting closer and spreading that out, because kids need to see people who look like them to look up to. It's that coach, that teacher, that guidance counselor, that school principal who often is the person who reaches for a kid and helps to pull them up and help them see a different future for themselves. I also want to go back, I think, to what Wedna said in terms of access to those rich and rigorous programs. It really starts with choices that adults make. We as adults have to do a better job of making sure that we're giving kids opportunity and access from the very beginning. VPK has a tremendous impact on outcomes all the way through graduation, from reading performance, math performance, and like I said, improved graduation rates. So we want our adults to encourage kids, enroll in those rigorous VPK programs. It matters for kindergarten readiness, and we know that equity starts there. But it goes beyond that. We now do screening for all gifted children, all children, in 2nd grade. So we're not just looking at kids that teachers or parents would refer, but we screen all children for for the gifted program, which has greatly diversified our gifted programs across the district. And then it goes back to intentional scheduling, making sure whether it's 5th grade or 8th grade or AP or IB or dual enrollment or industry certification, that we're not looking at necessarily just a test score, but we're also looking at students' interests, students' potentials, and encouraging them to take those rigorous courses and opening access to all. And then as Glenn mentioned, it's about providing equity. Some kids may need more support, they may need more tools, they may need more time than others to be successful. Equal isn't always good enough, but we can make sure that all students have the support they need if we're very intentional about it.
Yeah, and Dr. Marsh, talk about the importance of not only seeing someone who looks like you, but very often there are black male students who don't see another male teacher in the classroom for a very long time, if ever.
Well, this actually mirrors and kind of connects to what Dr. Pace just articulated. When people are, or specifically teachers are recommending students, right? Oftentimes those recommendations are based on subjective characteristics. So whether or not Johnny asked for assistance for their homework, whether or not Sarah is seeking out conversations with other people. So at the end of the day, it's subjectively teachers are ushering students into these IB advanced placement programs. But I think to your point, this idea that if you don't see someone that looks like you, you don't believe that you can perhaps achieve at those particular levels. I think beyond sort of mentorship, but part of the life experience, right? When I'm walking to school and I feel like I'm being followed by a police officer, who do I turn to? I don't have another black male teacher or another black male person to have conversation with, to let them know how it makes me feel. Because I think at the end of the day, part of the problem becomes thinking about the context of black males and black people in this country, particularly males. There's a social construction, right? We black men have been sort of demonized, if you will, as it relates to our position and our positionality in the context of this country. So I think we need to really push conversations about, again, affirmation to make sure that we have teachers in classrooms that can look like me, look like Glenn and all the other black males who are in this fight to make sure that education is more equitable and not just equal.
Sure, if you can see them, then you believe you can be them as well. So you need that sort of modeling. And Ms. Lay, as a teacher in the classroom, do you find your experience with other students of color, do you feel that they have a greater appreciation because they can maybe come to you because they understand that you may understand where they are coming from?
I do think that the students that I have will come to me and do see me as a role model. My biggest purpose in my room is to build relationships, and I build relationships with all my students, but there seems to be with the minority students, when we establish a relationship, even after they've passed my class and they moved on to another grade level, they will come back just to talk, just to come in and let me know how they're going, how things are going with them, to fill me in. And if they're having a challenging issue, they will come to me and ask for guidance, and I continue those relationships. I have students this year that are graduating. My first class of 5th graders are graduating this year, and I have already received senior pictures and students have sent graduation invitations, and Ms. Lay, we're checking in and emailing me. So I think it is important for them to see.
Yeah, that's so. What has your experience been in the classroom? Have you had very many teachers of color, and how has that experience been for you?
In the classroom, in my junior year and my senior year, I haven't had many colored teachers in the classroom, but I do connect with some of my teachers, but through their background. Some of them may be from a different country, their parents may be from a different country, and I can share with them like the dream of becoming something someday. And sometimes within the classroom, when I don't have like a colored teacher, or a teacher that I can relate to, I almost feel as if I have to be pitch perfect. I have to get every question right. I can't answer and I can't ask any questions, or they may think less of me, or I can't, let's say if they ask a question, I can't raise my hand if I'm unsure of the answer, because I'm scared if I answer and it's wrong, they'll automatically unwrite me for, oh, she got this question right, oh, she's not fit to do this, or she's not fit to do that.
Boy, that seems like a lot of pressure on top of your rigorous curriculum, which you're acing right now. I want to ask you about something that I heard happened to you, because you are, if I'm not mistaken, are you bilingual?
Yes, I am.
Okay, explain what happened when they thought at your school they learned that you spoke another language.
So, my parents, of course, you know, they always put that I speak Creole, because I do. And when I entered middle school, I thought, okay, I'm finally done with ESOL. You know, I passed my ESOL test, 3rd grade, and I get into 6th grade, and I'm asking to take these rigorous courses, the NYP program, and they keep denying me and putting me in ESOL classes. And I spent 2 years in ESOL classes, and I wasted those 2 years instead of challenging myself and being in the right position that I needed to be in. They refused me and they denied me just because I spoke a different language. They thought that I was incapable of, you know, speaking that language and speaking English fluently, you know, which I think is bizarre, because I feel like when a student does speak a different language, it expands their knowledge, and, you know, they're able to see things in many perspectives.
Yeah, you would think that speaking a second language would actually be a bonus, not a deterrent from progressing. Dr. Marsh, what is that about? What can you explain why that would have happened?
You know, that's unfortunate, but we still see it today. There was a study that was done in another southern state, and teachers were assessed about their students, and I want to say it was like 60% of the teachers, when they heard the use of the language Spanish, they associated that with bad behavior and poverty. And this is a 2017 study. So it's problematic how we are framing students and their communities. You know, part of this speaks to professional development. Part of this speaks to what are these sort of courageous conversations that we're not having, in the context of our schools, in the context of public, again, context of not only in the context of schools, but in the context of these private spaces. When people are not in their school building, like, what are we thinking about the other group that speaks another language? What do we think about the individual who has a different phenotype, right? The different skin color. And so this is going to take courageous conversations, not only in where the young lady school is, but across the country. I'm going to continue to say this. We need to create affirming experiences for all our babies. And that means highlighting and valuing every aspect of what they bring into our classrooms. Until we do that, we will not be able to build the relationships like Miss DeLay, excuse me if I said your name incorrectly, who teaches mathematics, right? She's intentionally building relationships with her students because she values every attribution of her students, and that's important.
Yeah, and you know, you talk about building that in the classroom. I want to ask you all about something that we should see more, or should we actually see more of this in the classroom? The textbooks sometimes don't actually reflect what the student in the classroom looks like. I can remember my school days. I don't think I saw a brown child in a book until maybe I was in high school or college. How important is it that kids now see themselves reflected in the literature we're talking about? Dr. Pace, we'll start with you.
You know, I think that certainly needs to be a priority as we're moving forward. The state has adopted new standards. We're looking at new ELA resources. Let's make sure that those resources do reflect all of our students, not just some of the students. As Dr. Marsh said, that's so critically important. It's been a long time since we've had an opportunity to look at new textbooks in ELA, in particular English language arts, but that's a critical piece. But it's true whether we're talking about English language arts or social studies, kids do need to see their lives, their experiences across the world reflected in that. That's one of the things that I love and value about the International Baccalaureate program, is that it really strives for that international mindedness, how we can see and have a greater appreciation for other cultures, other people who might be different than us. But that's what makes the world rich. We just have to make sure that we're keeping an open mind and providing equal access to all of those types of learning experiences.
But how do we get those rich experiences in the classroom from the very beginning? And I'm talking about VPK, when the first book they open might be a child child who looks like them. How is something like that so important and valuable and life-changing?
I think it goes back to one of the other things Dr. Marsh said, some really internal look at all of ourselves and who we are as people and who we are as educators and who are the students that we're serving. And then we've got to make a more intentional effort to locate those resources, to ask. I also love the opportunity that we have tonight to listen to Wedna. Hearing student voice is such an important part of this because they are honest, they are candid, and their experiences are real, and we can all learn from them to be better educators and better community leaders.
Yeah, and she has been a great voice to listen to because it's been a long time. I can speak for myself since I was in high school. So it's really it's good to hear about her experience and to just know and have an idea of what's happening instead of just reporting on it. Dr. Marsh, what would you say about the importance of having textbooks in classroom that reflect all the students, not just, a rainbow of students in these books?
Certainly. I mean, so for example, obviously at the collegiate level, we have a little bit more autonomy, right, to select our books. I'm making sure, and before I even get to a textbooks, let me just tell you something I do every semester, whether it's at UCF or any institution I've ever had the honor to be a part of. First day, I ask for your first, I want people to articulate their first and last names. I want them to articulate it because I want to make sure that I'm going to pronounce their name accurately. I'm asking for the preferred gender, the preferred pronouns, because again, I'm trying to honor their experiences. At the end of the day, if I don't honor their experience, whether that's their phenotype, their gender, their religion, their ethnicity, their community, this is going to be a problematic situation for me because at the end of the day, I want to ensure that they have an experience because I don't know that everyone that they're having classes with are going to value those opportunities to engage with them. So to your point about textbooks, at this age, at Wedna's age and younger, it's vitally important to see people that represent us. It's vitally important. How do we aspire if we don't see it? I mean, this really does go back to these cliches, but if we do not see it, can we actually think we can be it? So if it's not in the context of a classroom, hopefully I'm getting something in perhaps a religious setting or an after-school program or some other sort of counter space that will speak to my experience, but it really does start at this pre-K level.
And Mr. Gilson, can you speak to that as well?
So there's an old saying that perception equals reality. If one can perceive it, one can believe it. And I think that's what our esteemed panelists are saying. And I think the opportunity there is having the community come together and ask their school board, ask the Department of Education, because they're the ones who determine the curriculum and determine what curriculum is approved for the state of Florida, and make sure that there's curriculum available that it has the representation for every community here in the state of Florida. We're a melting pot, right? And everyone has a different, unique experience. That's what makes our community very great and vibrant. And our schools and our education should reflect that as well.
Yeah, and it's still, we get excited when we do see books that reflect us. And even as an adult, I still get excited when I see myself represented on the page. So I can only, imagine what it means to younger kids to experience that for the first time. Ms. Lay, you're in the classroom every day with students. Can you speak to that?
When I taught elementary, because that's my original background, I made a deliberate attempt to stock my classroom library with a variety of books from different ethnicities to represent as many of my students and the population, the diversity in my classroom as I could. And those books I've carried with me. And so students are able to come into my room and get into the classroom and find books that are about them. And it's increased some of their interest in reading and to do research in whatever subject area there is because they're seeing themselves represented in those texts.
Yeah. So we have more questions from our viewers, and I want to get as many of those in as possible. Mr. Gilson, here's one for you. Tracy, and we kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but if you can unpack it a little bit more, that would be great. Tracy brought up concerns about how some schools might have less funds based on the tax base of the area they're in. She suggested using federal dollars to make sure that schools located in poorer areas get the same kind of funding as schools located in more affluent areas. What are your thoughts on this, she wants to know?
So that currently exists now through Title I funding. If you have a certain threshold of number of students who receive free and reduced lunch, that particular school and school district gets additional dollars from the federal government. So that currently exists now, and it's just, again, going about how does the school district, school board members allocate those dollars to make sure it's equitable for all kids. One of the things that you said, we talked about in the previous segment that I failed to mention about the books and having the books reflect the students. What I would also challenge, and you're going to see this challenge come from the Urban League as well, is that we also have to do our best part of getting mentors in the classroom, right? Again, it's a village. It's not just the school having to do the work on their own. We have to step up and help out as well. So the Urban League has a young professionals network that's made up of individuals between the ages of 18 through 40 who are either in the entry level, middle level of their career. And my goal now is to get them to come back into some of our Title I schools, come back into some of our low-income communities, because they are the role models. So yes, it's one thing to see a person of color in a book. It's another to have a person of color reading the book to you as well. And that's what you're going to see the Urban League do and step up to make sure that our communities get equity in education.
And Ms. Lay, we have a question for you. What advice would you have for fellow teachers on how to interact with parents of their Black or Hispanic students? It says some research has shown that these parents are only contacted when there's a problem in the classroom.
I think we need to start contacting parents from the get-go just to make a connection, because the more parents and students feel connected to school, the more they're going to engage and the more they're going to participate. And I think that it's going to turn some of the negatives that we're experiencing around because of the sense of community. Because when parents and teachers work together for the benefit of the student, we're getting that community. And we're getting that it's taking a village, so our village is coming together for the benefit of our students.
It's helpful when you know that child, you know the parents, you know the community, and you can sort of glean, okay, this kid is a cut-up. This is just how they perform. They don't mean anything by it. And one of the examples we have clearly here, and we have video, it happened recently. A 12-year-old in Colorado was recently suspended for playing with a toy gun during an online class. Now, if you can see that on your screen, look at the orange nozzle. That tells you that it's a fake gun, and all the lettering on there, it says that everything about it is fake. But according to the report filed by the school resource officer, the teacher says after seeing what looked like a toy gun, she first emailed the boy's parents and also told the school principal, who that principal then, instead of calling the parent, called the sheriff's office. A deputy showed up to the kid's home, and that child, that 12-year-old, was then suspended for 5 days. Now, the school said it would not comment for privacy reasons. Can any one of you tackle what might be wrong with that scenario?
We know that Tamir Rice, right, got killed with a toy gun in Cleveland, Ohio, which was ridiculous. And so the fact that this young man was at his, I apologize for sort of jumping in, but the fact that this young man was at his house online playing, right, during COVID-19, playing at his own house. Again, I'm gonna say playing at his own house. That's ludicrous. This goes to Ms. Lay's point. When we're in relationship with our parents, and students are, can kind of be comforted by them and see them as someone outside of their parental support that they can look up to, be entrusted with, that's a conversation with the parent. Hey, I saw, your young man, your son playing with a gun, maybe not during class. But at the end of the day, the problem becomes Tamir Rice being killed by police officers with a similar gun in a park in Cleveland, Ohio, nearly 18 years ago. Or rather, this would have been his 18. He would have turned 18 this year.
Yeah. Dr. Pace, can you talk a little bit about what might have been the proper protocol here?
Well, I think it goes back to several different things. Number one, obviously the relationship piece is important, really knowing your students and knowing their parents and understanding where they're coming from and what the appropriate reaction would be. I think there has to be some question as to whether or not it was playing or whether somebody was potentially threatened. We all have a heightened sensitivity about violence and guns and those types of things as it relates to education because of all that's happened in the environment. But I also think it goes back to what I talked about earlier in terms of training for our school resource officers and having those strong relationships with our law enforcement officers so that kids and parents and principals and teachers understand their role and see them as a positive presence, as a way to extend relationships, as opposed to something that's all about punishment. You know, certainly there are times that we have to investigate, but there are appropriate ways to do that, and then there are, you know, harsh ways to do that. And I think we have to look at each of those situations. But part of it too goes back to looking at our internal bias, putting that out there on the table, having those hard conversations about why we might prejudge a situation, as opposed to taking the time to really look at it from all angles and make a better decision.
Ms. Lay, as someone who is in the classroom and you deal with students every day, what might you have done in a situation like this, and what might you suggest in case this happens again to others who might be encountering something like this?
Reaching out to the parent, alerting the admin, as to what it was, but I would also let them know that it appears to be a toy gun, and possibly have admin contact the parents as well. And again, it goes back to that relationship.
So if something like that should happen to a student here, and say that student is suspended, is there an appeal process for that child? Because missing 5 days of even online learning is a big deal.
I am not sure about what happens in this county. I know from a previous experience, I had something similar happen, and there was an appeals process where my son was suspended for 10 days for a text message. So it was something that I didn't agree with, and he was suspended, and I had to go through an appeals process. So I'm pretty sure that in this area there's something like that.
Dr. Pace, I see you nodding.
There would be an appeals process in a situation like that, whether it's a 5-day suspension or a 10-day suspension or something more. Obviously parents can contact the school principal. If the decision came from the principal, they can contact that principal's supervisor. And if it goes beyond that, they can contact the superintendent's office. And then eventually it could make its way to the school board. But along the way, there are several different opportunities for the parent to call and say, can we relook at this? And ask for some assistance, and we'd certainly all be willing to provide it.
What was it, though, about this situation, and anyone can answer this question, what was it about this situation that they thought the best course of action for this 12-year-old is to call and send a deputy to his home? Because if you really care about this child, you don't email the parent, you call immediately. So, Dr. Marsh, can you talk to that a little bit?
I mean, this goes to sort of, we see the same sort of subjective calls in schools, right? Why certain people, why young people get selected for IB program, why some people get selected for the gifted and talented programs. These are subjective decisions, right? And so, to your point, I don't know what the rationale. We know disproportionately. We know that black boys, for example, are being suspended and expelled at disproportionate rates for doing the same thing that a white male would do. So that I would charge and ask the question of the teacher who made this call: would you have done this if it wasn't a black boy? And if that response is like, oh, I don't necessarily know, then this goes to what Dr. Payson, I think we're all been articulating. You need to have courageous moral conversations with yourself concerning why, in fact, this is the first immediate response, as opposed to having a conversation with a mother or try to setting up some time to have a one-on-one with that student. Hey, I saw that happen on the online class. I don't think that's appropriate. Let's have a conversation about what happened today. So I think we need to even engage students more when we think about discipline or punitive measures, because at the end of the day, he should not be missing 5 days for a toy gun. Just very similar that we know, Tamir Rice should not have been killed because of a toy gun. But to your point, relationships matter.
Yeah, and Mr. Gilzine, what would you say to that? What would be the best way to handle a situation such as that when you it's not real, but that's what the situation ends up being?
Yeah, and the panelists have said it, so I don't want to echo that. But what I would say is, I think our way of punishing students is archaic, and we have to change it. You can only be a third grader as an 8-year-old once in your lifetime. That's a true statement, right? So if we're doing punishment that is 5 days removed 10 days removed. The real question is, when they come back, who is actually doing the education during that time period, right? If mom is working 2 jobs and then that child is home on their own, who's actually helping that child academically? And then how would they come back and be ready to go on track with the rest of the students? It's virtually impossible. Yeah. So when we look at things like generational wealth, here in Central Florida, white communities have a net worth of $217,000. Hispanic have a net worth of $55,000. And then you look at African American net worth, which is $17,000, right? There's a direct correlation between that and education. And then when we look at the school to prison pipeline, and we see with the statistics that you shared at the very beginning of this conversation, that we only make up less than 20% of the population, but we make up almost 30 to 40% of the discipline rates, that's a direct correlation to why there's no wealth in our community. That's why there's a direct correlation to the number of lack of opportunities. So we have to fix this discipline problem, because if we don't, then these numbers will continue to be where they are, if not continue to raise. And again, all that is just feeding the school to prison pipeline.
Which is something we have seen far too much of lately, especially. Now, Wedna, I have a question for you, and no pressure, but you are our future. You're going to lead us all and guide us all into the future. You're getting ready to finish up high school and enter into the world of higher learning. What changes would you like to see in place for K through 12 students that come after you in the years to come? What would you like to see?
I would like to see many things, starting out with the change in punishment. I had a friend, she got dress code for a small rip in her pants, and I remember her, them taking her out of class for 2 days, and if you know IB, it moves fast paced. So when she came back and she was all, lost and confused, and, between other students trying to finish their work and teachers, finishing grading papers, it's like no one made time. It's like they kind of said, you made your bed and lay in it. When teachers give harsh punishments like that, like the little boy, he had 5 days suspension. It's hard to bounce back from that. Even a day of absence is hard to bounce back, because, the classroom is always learning, and something that you might have said, on Tuesday, and he's back Wednesday, you don't remember what you said. You don't remember that good connection that you made that could have clarified the whole lesson for him. Mm-hmm. And also, I'd like to see an increase in funding our youth. Our youth gets funded, and we invest into our youth as much as we do, but you can never invest too much into the future. I mean, the future, it's tomorrow. That's our future. Yeah. And we really need, as a community, we really need to come together and invest.
Yeah, and speaking of investing, our time is running short, but I'd like for each of you to answer the question of what is the one thing we can all do now as a community, to make sure that our students get what they need to prepare them for the future? What is the one thing that we can each individually in our community, if we're going to be a village, then we're all going to have to help each other. So what can I, as a villager, do right now to make sure that these kids get everything they need? Dr. Pace?
We have got to truly value the work of our teachers. They are really giving of their hearts and souls right now to do so many different things in the world of the pandemic, whether it's digital instruction or face-to-face instruction, or many of them are doing both, as Wedna mentioned. And until we recognize and value and appreciate that, I don't know that we're going to get more Black educators in our classrooms, which our kids need to see, and it just depreciates the whole importance of education. We know that starting as early as VPK, quality enrollment in those programs makes a difference all the way to graduation outcomes. And that's true all the way through VPK, through grade 12, and then on into adult ed. So the more that we can do to show value for our teachers, show value for education as an institution, and then rally around our families to get to that point of equity, where we're not just giving everybody the same, we're truly looking at what kids need and what we can do as a community to provide it. That's what I believe we need to do now.
Ms. Lay, what do you think we need to do?
I think it's important to establish a community effort, so reaching out to mentors, reaching out to other entities where students see people that look like them, and focus on community and building and the importance of education.
And Mr. Gilsden?
So I'll just say the inverse is identify a school and see how you can step up and help by volunteering, mentoring, and just giving of your time, especially to our children. As it mentioned earlier, is that it is a village to raise our children. Mm-hmm. So let's all step up and do our part.
And Dr. Marsh?
So this is the sort of this community approach. I would say honor people's lived experiences. Everything a person is coming to the table with. We as a collective need to honor individual lived experiences, and so that takes an ethical listening ear, one that when you hear about someone's lived experiences, now understand and internalize, well, how did that make me feel, or what did I think about them even before they share that lived experience? So I think at the end of the day, again, honoring everyone's lived experiences.
Give us an example of that, because I feel like some people will hear that, and what does that mean? Do I go out and I have coffee with you? Do I, come to your house for dinner? What does that mean?
Sure. I think, when we see that there's so many things that are taking place in our country, and sort of writing someone off as emotional or writing someone off as angry, really, so if this is a context of friendship, sometimes people don't speak to each other based upon what people have been posting on Facebook or Instagram. So reaching out, just say, hey, let's sit down, let's text, let's have a conversation. Can we socially distance? I don't know, but let's pick up the telephone and just to say, hey, I saw what you posted. Share a little bit about that. I don't understand that. And that becomes this ethical listening ear, because I want to actually understand your experience. I don't want to just write it off as something that, oh, you're feeling that kind of a way, but I want to sit down, again, whether it's virtually or otherwise, but to understand and truly understand your experience through your lens, through your mouth, and your experiences.
Yeah, and it's much better. Most people will just hide a person whose opinion they don't agree with or unfriend them on Facebook. But the truth is, we need to really engage those people. And we had this discussion before we did this program today. There was one from Millie, actually. She was a topic of discussion. Should we include her comment about the Obama administration and this being propaganda, and us not really wanting to talk about equality, but just wanting special treatment?
This gets to the Glenn's point. I don't necessarily believe that the problem sometimes becomes that we want to be a melting pot. But actually, I don't want us to be a melting pot. I want us to be a tossed salad. I want you to see the green. I want you to see everything about
all
a person.
All the flavors.
I want you to see all the flavors and experience all those things, right? So I think I'm glad you included it, because her experience and her lived experience also matters.
Well, I cannot thank you all for being here this evening, and I really appreciate your time. And I hope that folks who are watching on clickorlando.com, they were able to glean a little something from this and just recognize that it is up to each one of us to be the change that we want to see. And we want to leave you with a quote tonight about the importance of education, and it comes from one of my favorite people, Oprah Winfrey. She says, for every one of us that succeeds, it's because there's somebody there to show you the way out. The light doesn't always necessarily have to be in your family. For me, it was teachers and school. And we want to thank you all for being with us for this edition of Real Talk. Thank you for your time.